The gun hit the dirt before the echo of her voice had even faded. Tobias Wren stood in the center of the main street of Caldera, New Mexico, the afternoon sun burning the back of his neck like a brand, and he stared down at the belt he had just unbuckled. The holster, the ivory-handled Colt revolver, the loops of ammunition, all of it lay in the dust at his feet like a shed skin, like a life abandoned. Around him, the whole town had gone still. Men on the saloon porch stopped their conversations mid-sentence. A woman across the street pulled her child behind her skirt. The sheriff, old Gerald Hatch, leaned against the post office doorframe with his arms crossed and his face unreadable, watching. Nobody in Caldera had ever seen Tobias Wren take that belt off, not once in 4 years. And not a soul in the territory believed he ever would. Josephine Zahar stood 10 feet away from him, her dark eyes wide, her hands pressed flat against the front of her apron as if she needed something solid to hold on to. She had not expected him to do it. That was plain on her face, the shock, the confusion, and beneath both of those things, something far more fragile and far more dangerous, something that looked almost like hope. "Tobias," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the second syllable of his name. "You asked me to," he said simply. That was all. No grand speech, no elaborate explanation. He left the belt in the dust and walked toward her, and the whole town watched him cross that stretch of sun-scorched earth as if they were witnessing something sacred, something irreversible. He stopped directly in front of her. His hands were empty. His green eyes were steady. He was 28 years old and had spent the better part of a decade being one of the most feared men in 3 territories, and he stood before her like a man who had just put down the heaviest thing he had ever carried. "You asked me to," he said again, quieter this time. "So I did." Josephine pressed her lips together, her eyes filled though she blinked hard against it. "You cannot just," she started. "I can," he said. "I did." Behind her, through the window of the general store, a curtain twitched. Somewhere down the street a horse exhaled. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of dust and sage and the distant possibility of rain. And Josephine Zahar, who had come to Caldera running from a past she had never fully disclosed to anyone, reached out with both hands and took hold of his. That was the beginning of the end of Tobias Wren the Gunslinger, and the beginning of everything else. But to understand what that moment meant, what it cost and what it gave, you had to go back to the autumn of 1882, to the day Josephine's wagon wheel shattered on the ridge road 3 miles east of Caldera, and the man who stopped to help her was the last man in the territory anyone would have expected to stop at all. The road east of Caldera was not a road anyone used willingly. It curved through a narrow cut between 2 red rock ridges, the kind of passage that trapped heat in summer and turned treacherous with flash flood debris in the fall. In October of 1882, it was technically passable, but only barely, and Josephine Zahar had chosen it specifically because it was the route least likely to be traveled by anyone who might recognize her. She had been traveling for 11 days from Santa Fe. She had 1 trunk, a canvas bag, a small iron strongbox bolted to the wagon floor, and a bay mare named Clover, who had the calm disposition of a much older animal. She had a loaded derringer in her coat pocket, and a set of documents in the strongbox that were either going to save her life or end it, depending on whose hands they fell into. She was 24 years old, and she was the most alone she had ever been. When the rear left wheel hit the submerged rock and the axle cracked, the sound was violent enough to send Clover sideways in her harness and pitch the wagon into a 20-degree list that sent the trunk sliding, and Josephine herself grabbing the seat rail with both hands to avoid being thrown. She managed to bring the mare under control within moments, She was a better handler than she looked, but the wagon was not going anywhere. The axle was cracked clean through. Even if she could repair it, she did not have the tools. And even if she had the tools, she did not have the strength to jack the wagon alone. She sat on the tilted seat for a full minute, breathing deliberately, doing the arithmetic of her situation with the same controlled efficiency she applied to everything. She was 3 miles from a town she had never visited. She had no means of moving the wagon. She had a mare that could carry her but not the trunk, and she was not leaving the trunk. She climbed down, checked Clover's harness for damage, found none, and was in the middle of deciding whether to walk toward town or wait and hope for a passing traveler when she heard hoofbeats. A single horse, moving at a relaxed trot from the direction of Caldera. Her hand went immediately to her coat pocket. She wrapped her fingers around the derringer and did not draw it, but kept it there, and turned to face the sound with her chin up and her expression neutral. It was a practiced expression. She had been perfecting it since she was 17 years old, and learned that showing fear was an invitation. The rider who came around the curve in the road was not what she expected. He was tall in the saddle. She could see that even before the details resolved, riding a gray horse with the easy posture of someone who had spent so much time on horseback that it had become his natural state of being. He wore a dark coat, plain and well-worn, a battered hat the color of tobacco, and the kind of beard that suggested he had been on the road himself for several days. He was young, she realized as he drew closer. Younger than his bearing suggested. Late 20s, perhaps, with a lean, angular face and eyes that were already fixed on the disabled wagon with a calm, assessing look that took in everything at once. He slowed as he approached. He did not reach for the rifle in his scabbard, did not make any sudden movements. Simply guided his horse to a stop about 15 feet away and looked at the cracked axle with an expression of straightforward appraisal. "That axle is finished," he said. "I am aware," Josephine said. He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. His eyes were a particular shade of green that she had never quite seen before. Not the bright, vivid green of spring leaves, but something deeper and more complex, the green of still water over moss. There was nothing threatening in them. There was also nothing warm. They were simply attentive, and there was something in that attention that was different from the usual kind she received from men. No appraisal of her appearance, no calculation of her vulnerability. He was looking at her the same way he had looked at the broken axle, seeing the situation. "You heading to Caldera?" he asked. "That was my intention. I can take the mare on ahead and send someone with a cart for your wagon, or you can ride on and arrange it yourself." He paused. "What have you got in the trunk that you are not leaving?" She blinked. Nobody had said anything about the trunk. "How do you know I am not leaving the trunk?" "Because you are standing next to the wagon instead of walking toward town," he said. 3 miles is a reasonable walk in good boots. So whatever is in the wagon matters more to you than getting to shelter before dark. She studied him for another moment. "Who are you?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He swung down from the gray horse with an unhurried ease and dropped the reins, and the horse stood where it was placed without being tied, which told her something about the horse and something more about its rider. He walked to the wagon and crouched to examine the axle, running one hand along the split wood. "Tobias Wren," he said, as if the name meant nothing in particular. It meant something to her. She had heard that name in Santa Fe, in a conversation that had not been intended for her ears, spoken in the same careful tone people used for things that were both dangerous and useful. She had filed it away without thinking she would ever have cause to retrieve it. Now she retrieved it, and examined it rapidly against the man crouching in the road dust in front of her broken wagon. Tobias Wren, the gunslinger who had cleaned out the Delver gang 3 years back and left 6 men in the Tucson County Jail without apparently breaking a sweat. The man that Marshal Cody Brecht of the Santa Fe district had referred to, in the conversation she had overheard, as the only honest gun left in the New Mexico territory. She took her hand out of her pocket. "I am Josephine Zahar," she said. He looked up at her. Then he stood, and he was taller than she had registered from the saddle, a full head taller than her, and he looked at her with that same calm attention. "You need a cart," he said, "and you need somewhere to stay while the axle is repaired. Both of those things can be arranged in Caldera." He paused again. "The question is whether you want company getting there or whether you would rather I just send someone back." It was the most considerate formulation of that choice she had heard in a long time. He was not assuming she wanted his help. He was not assuming she was helpless. He was presenting her options and waiting for her decision. She looked at him for another long moment. "Company would be acceptable," she said. He nodded once, as if that was entirely reasonable, and began unhitching Clover from the wagon. She helped, and they worked in silence that was not uncomfortable, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. Most silences with strangers in her experience were filled with the other person's discomfort or their poorly concealed curiosity. This silence was simply functional. He knew what he was doing with the harness and did not need direction. She knew what she was doing and did not need to be watched. They were two capable people performing a task together, and there was something quietly remarkable about that. When Clover was free of the wagon, he looked at the horse, then at the trunk through the wagon's open back. "I can take the trunk on Cassidy," he said, meaning his gray horse, "and you ride the mare. Or the reverse. Your horse can manage the trunk. He is a draft cross. He has carried worse." She thought about it. The trunk weighed approximately 60 pounds. The Derringer was in her pocket. The documents were in the trunk, locked, and the key was on a cord around her neck beneath her collar. "Cassidy takes the trunk," she said. "I will ride Clover." He loaded the trunk with a competence that suggested he had handled freight before, balancing it across the gray horse's back, and securing it with rope he produced from his saddlebag. Then he mounted Cassidy, she mounted Clover, and they set off toward Caldera in the late afternoon light. He did not ask her where she had come from. He did not ask her what was in the trunk. He did not ask her anything at all, actually, for the first mile, which was the most respectful silence she had encountered in years. Then, somewhere along the second mile, with the red ridges casting long shadows across the road and the air taking on the cool edge that preceded a desert sunset, he said, "How long have you been traveling?" 11 days from Santa Fe," she said. He absorbed that. "You were avoiding the main road." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Are you in danger?" he asked. Not alarmed, not avid with curiosity, just asking the way you might ask someone if they needed water. She considered the honest answer to that question for the length of several horse steps. "Potentially," she said. He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "Caldera is a quiet town," he said. "Sheriff Hatch runs a clean operation. If you need time to sort something out, it is as good a place as any." "You live there." "I stay there," he said. "Between work." She understood what that meant. She had heard enough about his kind of work to understand what between work meant for a man like Tobias Wren. "And what are you between currently?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a flatness that was not coldness but rather the complete absence of performance, "Nothing pressing." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking ahead at the road, his profile clean against the fading sky. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away without conscious effort. not a mask, exactly, but a very practiced stillness. And yet there was something in the line of his jaw, some tension that was not quite relaxed, that suggested the stillness was maintained rather than natural. She looked away. She had her own maintained stillnesses. She recognized the effort. They reached Caldera as the last color left the sky. Caldera was small, a main street of packed dirt flanked by a general store, a saloon called the Red Rider, a livery stable, the sheriff's office, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, a blacksmith shop, a hotel of 6 rooms, and a scattering of houses behind the commercial buildings. It was the kind of town that existed because the geography demanded a stopping point, not because anyone had dreamed it into being. It was practical and unromantic and utterly functional, and Josephine found herself unexpectedly reassured by it. Tobias took her to the hotel first, where the owner, a compact woman in her 50s named Ruth Hayden, looked at them both with the particular sharp perception of someone who had seen everything a frontier town could produce, and was not particularly surprised by any of it. "You need a room," Ruth said to Josephine. "I need a room, and I need a locksmith or a good carpenter who can repair a wagon axle," Josephine said. "The carpenter is Frank Osai. He does both," Ruth said. "I will send my boy for him in the morning. Room is 50 cents a night. Meals are included." She glanced at Tobias. "Your trunk is in storage, my horse has it," Tobias said. "Leave it in the livery tonight," Ruth told Josephine. "Luther, who runs the stable, is honest, has not lost anything in 12 years. "Thank you," Josephine said. Ruth handed her a key. Josephine turned to Tobias to say something. She was not entirely sure what, and found him already taking a step back, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his face expressing nothing particular. "I hope you are settled soon," he said. "Very simple, very contained." "Thank you for your help," she said with genuine feeling. "With the wagon and with all of it," he nodded once. He turned to go. "Mr. Wren," she said. He stopped. "I appreciate that you did not ask me what is in the trunk," she said, "or why I was on that road." He turned back slightly, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His green eyes caught the lamplight from the hotel window. "It is your business," he said, "not mine." And then he was gone into the evening dark, leading Cassidy toward the livery, and Josephine stood in the hotel doorway with her key in her hand, and the unprecedented and slightly disorienting feeling that she had just met someone entirely outside the category of people she had previously known. She went upstairs to her room, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. She did not sleep well, which was normal for her in new places. But when she did sleep, she did not dream of the things that usually chased her. She dreamed of a gray horse carrying a heavy trunk down a road in the fading light, and a man riding beside her in a silence that asked nothing of her at all. She found him at breakfast the next morning. Ruth's dining room was a long, narrow space with 6 tables covered in oilcloth, and Tobias Wren was seated at the one nearest the window, working through a plate of eggs and biscuits with the unhurried focus of someone who had learned not to leave food unfinished. He looked up when she came in, and there was a flicker of something in his face. Not quite surprise, not quite pleasure, but something in between, before it settled back into its habitual quiet. She sat across from him without asking, which he did not seem to mind. Ruth brought her coffee before she had even settled into the chair, which told her that Ruth had opinions about the situation that she was keeping to herself. "Did you sleep?" Tobias asked. "Well enough," she said. "You?" "I always sleep," he said, which was such an unexpected answer that she looked at him sharply, trying to determine if it was a joke. His face was completely straight, but something in his eyes suggested that he knew precisely how peculiar it sounded. "That is remarkable," she said. It is useful, he agreed. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked out the window at the morning street. A man was crossing toward the blacksmith shop. 2 horses were tied outside the general store. A dog trotted purposefully along the boardwalk as if it had appointments to keep. "Frank Osai will come this morning?" she asked. Ruth said so. "She runs a tight operation." He did not elaborate, but his tone carried a kind of quiet respect that she noted. They ate in companionable silence, which was, she was beginning to understand, his preferred mode of existing in the world. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had enough respect for silence to not fill it unnecessarily. When Frank Osai arrived, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with the careful hands of someone who worked with wood for a living, Josephine accompanied him to the livery to look at the wagon axle situation. Tobias came too, though she had not asked him to, and she found she did not object to this. He contributed one useful technical observation about the specific kind of crack in the axle, and then stepped back and let Osai make his assessment. The repair would take 4 days, Osai said. 4 days was longer than Josephine had intended to stay anywhere. She had been moving with the logic of flight, put distance between herself and Santa Fe, put distance between herself and the man whose name appeared on those documents in her trunk, and keep moving until she found somewhere that the distance was sufficient. But 4 days in Caldera, with the sheriff described as clean and honest and a man who already knew she was carrying something worth protecting riding a horse in the same livery as her trunk. 4 days here might be the safest 4 days she had spent in 2 months. She agreed to the timeline. And then, because the morning was early and she had nothing to do while Osai went for materials, and because Tobias was still standing in the livery doorway with the morning light on his face and a look of uncomplicated availability, she said, "Would you show me the town?" He looked at her with that steady green gaze. "There is not much of it," he said. "That is fine," she said. "I can manage a small tour." The corners of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one which she found, unreasonably, far more compelling than a full smile would have been. "All right," he said. He showed her Caldera in the morning light, and it took approximately 40 minutes because, as he had promised, there was not much of it. But he showed it with a spare accuracy that she appreciated. He knew who owned what. He knew which businesses were honest and which cut corners. He knew where the water source was, and whether it was reliable. It was fed by an underground spring that had never failed. And he knew the names of the people they passed with a clarity that suggested he paid attention to his world. He introduced her to Sheriff Gerald Hatch, who was indeed clean-looking and direct-speaking, a man of perhaps 60 with a gray mustache and eyes that were kind but not credulous. Hatch shook her hand and said he hoped her wagon was repaired quickly, and if she needed anything while she was in town, she should come directly to him, which she took as an invitation to trust him, and a signal that Tobias had probably already said something to him about her situation. She glanced at Tobias as they left the sheriff's office. "You spoke to him about me," she said, "not an accusation." "I told him you were having your wagon repaired and that you were staying at Ruth's," he said. "Nothing else." She studied him. He returned her gaze without defensiveness. "I told him you might benefit from a quiet stay," he said after a moment. He understood what that meant. She thought about being irritated at having her situation communicated without her consent. And then she thought about the practical reality of being a woman alone in a small town, with something valuable in her trunk, and a potentially dangerous man somewhere behind her on the road. And she decided that irritation was a luxury she could not currently afford. "Thank you," she said. "I think you can revise that later if you decide I overstepped," he said, and now there was definitely something in his face that was almost humor. It startled a small laugh out of her, the first one she had produced in what felt like a long time, and the sound of it seemed to surprise both of them. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she could not quite categorize, and then he looked away at the street, and neither of them said anything, and the quiet between them had a different quality than it had before. Warmer, somehow, more permeable. She was in danger of finding Tobias Wren interesting. She was already, she suspected, past the point of not finding him interesting. This was inconvenient, given that she had documents in a locked trunk that could put both of them in genuine peril if the wrong person came looking. 4 days in Caldera. She would be careful. She was not, it turned out, particularly good at being careful where Tobias Wren was concerned. The second day began with rain, proper autumn rain, the cold, steady kind that turned the main street to mud and kept most of Caldera's population indoors. Josephine spent the morning in her room working through the problem she had been carrying since Santa Fe, spreading the documents from the strong box across the bed and examining them in the gray window light. The documents were a sworn affidavit, a ledger, and 3 letters. Together, they constituted proof that a man named Harrison Voss, who was currently the acting land commissioner for the New Mexico territorial government, had been accepting bribes to invalidate the land grants of Mexican and Spanish families who had held title to their properties for generations. He had been doing it systematically, with the assistance of a lawyer named Prescott Cole, and the result had been the displacement of over 30 families in the past 3 years. Josephine had been working as a clerk in the Territorial Records Office in Santa Fe when she had discovered the pattern. She had spent 4 months quietly gathering evidence before Voss's people realized she was looking. When they realized, they had moved to remove her from the position, and then, when that proved insufficient to stop her, to threaten her more directly. The threat had come through Prescott Cole, delivered in the courthouse corridor, in language that was measured and civil on its surface, and entirely clear in its meaning. She had left Santa Fe the next morning. She was carrying the proof to a federal marshal in the district of Albuquerque. A man she had been told, through careful inquiry, was honest and beyond Voss's reach. But getting there without being intercepted required time and caution, and a route that would not put her on anyone's expected path. Caldera was off the expected path. She sat on the bed and looked at the documents and thought about Tobias Wren in the room below her, or in the saloon across the street, or wherever he was on this rainy morning, and she thought about what it would mean to trust someone. She had not trusted anyone in a long time. Trust had costs that she had learned were often more than she could afford, but Tobias Wren had not asked her what was in the trunk. She was still thinking about that when there was a knock at her door, 2 precise knocks without urgency, and she gathered the documents quickly, replaced them in the strongbox, locked it, and slipped the key back under her collar before she crossed to the door. He was standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression of complete tranquility. "Ruth made a fresh pot," he said. "I thought you might want one." She stared at him for a moment. "That was very thoughtful," she said. "The rain makes it necessary," he said, and she could not entirely tell whether he was being practical or wry, so she decided both were equally plausible and stepped back to let him in. He looked at the strongbox on the bed as he handed her a cup. He looked at it without looking at her, with the careful peripheral awareness of someone who registered details without drawing attention to registering them. Then he sat in the room's single chair, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and they drank coffee while the rain moved against the window. "Harrison Voss," she said. He looked at her. She had not entirely planned to say it, but she had been carrying it alone for 2 months, and there was something about this particular quiet that made the weight of it more apparent. "You know that name?" she asked. He thought about it. "Land Commissioner," he said. "Santa Fe." "Yes." He looked at the strongbox. "That is what you have," he said. "I have proof of what he has been doing," she said, "to families who have held land in this territory for 100 years. He has been invalidating their grants, having them reprocessed under territorial law, and selling the rights to land speculators." She paused. "I was a clerk. I saw the pattern. I gathered evidence. And then he found out you were gathering it. His lawyer found out. A man named Prescott Cole." Something moved through Tobias's face at that name. A very brief, very contained movement. Recognition, she thought, and something harder than recognition. "You know Cole," she said. "I know of him," Tobias said carefully. "He represents certain interests in the territory that intersect with the kind of work I do. Dangerous interests." "Yes." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I am taking the documents to the federal marshal in Albuquerque, a man named Durward. I was told he is not in Voss's pocket." "Marshal Calvin Durward," Tobias said. "He is not. He is one of the cleaner ones." He paused. "How were you told that?" "A judge in Santa Fe, Judge Almont. He has been watching Voss for 2 years and could not move without evidence." Tobias set down his coffee cup with a measured quietness. "You have been doing this alone," he said. "For how long?" 4 months of evidence gathering," she said. 2 months of running." He was quiet for a long time. The rain talked steadily against the window. A horse moved somewhere below on the street, its hooves muted by the mud. "You are not going to Albuquerque alone," he said. It was not a command. It was not a performance of protectiveness. It was stated with the same flat, factual quality with which he had said your axle is finished, as if it were simply an accurate assessment of a situation. She looked at him. "I was not under the impression that you had any obligation in this matter," she said. "I do not," he agreed. "But Cole employs people, and if they are on your trail and you are on the road alone with documentation that could bring down a territorial land commissioner, then the odds are not good." He looked at her steadily. "I am between work. I know the road to Albuquerque, and I know how to handle the kind of men Cole sends. I cannot pay you what a man in your position typically earns," she said. "I am not asking to be paid," he said. She studied him for a long, careful moment. She was very good at reading people. She had been doing it as a survival skill since childhood, and what she read in Tobias Wren was not a hidden agenda. There was no calculation beneath the offer. There was simply a man who had decided that a thing needed doing and was offering to do it. "Why?" she asked, not suspicious. Genuinely asking, he looked at the window for a moment. "Because what Voss has been doing is wrong," he said. "Because those families have not done anything to deserve it. Because you have been carrying something very heavy for a long time by yourself." He paused. "And because I find that I would rather you arrived safely in Albuquerque than not." The last part was said with a different quality than the first 3, quieter, more internal, as if it had surprised him slightly. She felt the heat of it in her chest. She set it aside and looked at the problem pragmatically. "The wagon will be ready in 3 more days," she said. "The wagon is too slow and too conspicuous," he said. "Cole's men will be looking for a wagon on the main routes. We should go on horseback with the essentials, the documents, and the wagon. Osai can keep it here and you can send for it once you are in Albuquerque. Ruth will vouch for the arrangement." She thought about this. It was tactically sound. She hated leaving the wagon behind. It was all she had of the life she had left in Santa Fe, but she hated being dead or captured more. 3 more days here then," she said. "While the weather is bad and the roads are difficult. Then we ride." He nodded. Then he picked up his coffee cup again. 3 more days, he said. Those 3 days were, in retrospect, the beginning of everything. Not because anything dramatic happened during them, it was almost the opposite. They were 3 days of ordinary proximity, of meals shared in Ruth's dining room and evenings spent in the hotel's small common room while the rain continued to fall outside, and conversations that began practically and drifted, almost without intention, into something else. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers, on a farm that had been struggling when he left it at 17. That he had drifted west with the vague intention of finding work, and had found it in the kind that paid well and asked questions last. That he had been at it for 10 years, and had managed, through some combination of accuracy and careful judgment about which jobs to take, to stay on what he considered the right side of the law, though he acknowledged the line was not always clear. He learned that she had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a Lebanese merchant who had come to America with ambition and died with it unrealized, leaving her and her mother to manage on their own. That she had taught herself to read contracts when she was 16 and had been working in legal offices since she was 18, steadily moving west as opportunities and necessity directed her. That she had come to Santa Fe 3 years ago because Judge Almond had been looking for a meticulous clerk, and she had been looking for work that mattered. And it did matter, Tobias said. They were in the common room, the fire burning low, the rain finally easing on the second evening. "What you found?" "Yes," she said. "It does." She was quiet for a moment. The families who lost those grants, some of them had been on that land since before New Mexico was a territory, since before it was American territory at all, and Voss just erased that with a stamp and a signature. "That is its own kind of violence," Tobias said. She looked at him, surprised by the phrasing. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." He was looking at the fire. The amber light made him look different from his daytime self, less contained somehow, more present in his own face. "The men I have put in the ground," he said after a moment, speaking with the careful quietness of someone choosing words with precision. "Most of them were pointing guns at someone who had no means to defend themselves. That is what I have always told myself." He paused. "I wonder sometimes if it is enough of a reason." She considered him carefully. "Do you still wonder?" He looked at her then. The firelight was in his eyes. "More lately," he said, simply. She understood what that meant in the way you understand things that have not yet been spoken directly. She understood it, and she set it aside, as she had set aside the heat in her chest 2 days ago, because they were going to be on the road together in 48 hours carrying something dangerous, and clarity was more useful than whatever this was becoming. But she was also, somewhere beneath the clarity, no longer setting it entirely aside. On the morning of the 4th day, the rain had stopped, and the sky was the cold, brilliant blue of October in the high desert. They rode out of Caldera before first light, with the strongbox wrapped in canvas and tied to Cassidy's saddlebag, and Clover moving steadily beside the gray in the dark. Tobias had arranged the route the evening before, explaining it to her with the directness of a man who expected her to have opinions about it, which she did. They would take the back road south, avoiding the main trading route, and cut west toward Albuquerque through the Manzano foothills. It was longer, it was less traveled, it was significantly safer. She had memorized the route and agreed to it. They rode through the first hour in silence, which was comfortable. Then the light came up, and the landscape revealed itself. Red and amber and pale gold, the desert in its autumn character, vast and beautiful and indifferent. And she found herself looking at it with a different quality of attention than she usually applied to the world outside windows. She was usually moving through landscape with some practical objective in front of her. This morning she was also looking at it and she noticed. "You are different in the morning," Tobias said. She glanced at him. "How so?" "Less defended," he said. Then, as if he had not expected to say it, he looked ahead at the road. She thought about being offended. Then she thought about whether it was true. Then she said, "So are you." He rode without responding for a moment. Then, "Fair enough." They made good time through the morning and ate from the provisions Ruth had pressed on them. Biscuits, jerked meat, dried apricots. At midday, while the horses grazed on a patch of dry grass near a shallow stream, Tobias sat on a flat rock and she sat on the ground beside it, and they ate without ceremony. "Tell me about Prescott Cole," she said. "What you know." He thought about it before he spoke, which she had come to recognize as his habit. He did not say things until he was sure of them. "Cole practices law in Santa Fe, but his real work is in negotiations of the more irregular kind. He connects people who have money to spend with people who have influence to sell, and he ensures that the transactions are clean enough to survive scrutiny." He paused. "He employs two men primarily for work that goes beyond legal negotiation. One is called Del Stringer. The other is a man named Rowe. I have no first name for him." "I have seen Stringer," she said, "in the courthouse, watching me." Something tightened in Tobias's face. "When?" "3 weeks before I left. He was in the corridor outside the records office. I did not know who he was then." "He is a tracker," Tobias said. "He is good at it." "Do you think he is following me?" Tobias was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than his usual pauses. "I think it is possible," he said. "Which is why we are going this way instead of the main road." She absorbed this. "What would Cole's objective be?" she asked. "The documents, obviously, but me." "Cole is careful," Tobias said. "He prefers to make problems disappear quietly. Taking the documents and leaving you unharmed is cleaner legally. Harming you creates additional complications." "That is comforting," she said dryly. "I meant it to be," he said, and she could hear that he genuinely did. "Cole is ruthless, but he is not reckless. His goal is protecting Voss, not creating a trail." She thought about this on and off through the afternoon as they rode south through the Manzano foothills, the terrain growing rougher and more dramatic, the sky immense above them. Tobias was alert in a way that did not present as anxiety. He simply noticed things, consistently and without drama, scanning the horizon and the hillsides with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom awareness was muscle memory. Twice he changed their route without explanation, guiding Cassidy down a different path and waiting for her to follow. The third time he did it, she asked why. "Riders," he said. "2 of them up on the ridge, moving in the same direction we are." She looked at the ridge and saw nothing. "I will take your word for it," she said. He did not look smug. He never looked smug. "They may be unrelated, but I would rather add 2 hours to our travel time than not." 2 hours, she agreed. They camped that night in a hollow between 2 rock formations that Tobias chose for the same practical reasons he chose everything. Concealed from the ridge, visible to the approach, near enough to water. He built a fire that was small enough to provide warmth without advertising itself, and they arranged themselves on opposite sides of it, with the unself-consciousness of people who had accepted the practical necessities of the situation. She lay on her side and looked at the fire, and thought about the fact that she was in the desert with a man she had met 4 days ago, trusting him with something she had not trusted anyone with in 2 months, and that somehow the decision had not felt like a decision at all. It had felt like a recognition. "You do this regularly," she said. "Sleep under the sky." "More often than in beds," he said. From across the fire his voice was low and even. "Do you not want," she hesitated, "a different kind of life?" The fire crackled quietly. "I have not thought about it as a realistic option," he said. "But if it were," a pause. Yes, he said. I think I would want that. She listened to the desert at night, which was not silence but a complex of small sounds, insects, wind in the rock, the distant breath of the horses. What would it look like? She asked. Another long pause. Something settled, he said. Something that had a reason to it other than the next job. Something, he stopped. Something with someone in it, she said. He did not answer. But the fire was between them, and she could see the stillness of him across it, and the stillness had a different character than his usual contained quiet. It was the stillness of something held carefully. Go to sleep, Josephine, he said, very gently. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she did. The second day on the road was harder. The terrain was more demanding and the horses were working, and Tobias was more watchful, the kind of watchful that communicated without words that something had shifted in his assessment. At mid-morning he stopped on a rise and looked back the way they had come. They are back there, he said, the riders from yesterday, one of them, following our trail. He turned the gray and looked at the route ahead. We are 2 days from Albuquerque at this pace. If we push it, we can make the outskirts tomorrow night. Then we push it, she said. They pushed it. By afternoon, they were moving at a pace that was harder on the horses than she liked. But Clover was managing, and Cassidy seemed to barely notice. And Tobias set the pace with a calm efficiency that communicated he had done things like this before and knew where the limits were. At dusk, he chose a campsite that was higher than the previous nights, more visibility, less shelter, a trade-off she understood without having to ask about it. He was sacrificing concealment for sightlines. He needed to see what was coming. She watched him settle the horses and thought, this is a man who has been hunted before. She thought also, this is a man who does not want to be hunted anymore. The second thought surprised her with its clarity. After they ate, she said, when this is over, when I have delivered the documents and Voss is dealt with, what will you do? He looked across the fire at her. I had not thought that far, he said. Think now, she said, his mouth curved very slightly. Are you directing me? I am asking you an honest question, she said. You can decline to answer. He looked at the fire for a moment. I would like to stay somewhere for a while, he said, without a reason to leave. She felt the weight of that in her chest. Caldera is a quiet town, she said. His own words returned. He looked at her across the fire, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it at a distance that she both respected and found maddening. It is, he said. She went to sleep holding that thought carefully, like a thing that might break under too much attention. On the third morning, the rider following them made his presence explicit. He came out of the scrub on the south side of the trail, perhaps 100 yards behind them, making no attempt at concealment. It was a message. He was letting them know they were seen. Josephine felt the cold of it along her spine. Tobias had seen him before she said anything. Keep riding, he said quietly. Maintain your pace. Do not look back. There is only one, she said. One visible, he said. They rode for another hour with that presence behind them, constant and deliberate. Tobias was absolutely composed, not tense, not anxious, just deeply, precisely attentive. She matched his composure with effort, then he said, the road curves ahead. When we go around that bend, pull Clover in behind those rocks and stay there until I say otherwise. What are you going to do? Talk to him, Tobias said. And if talking does not work, he looked at her very directly. It will work, he said. She obeyed. She went around the bend and pulled Clover behind the rock formation, and she heard, a few minutes later, the sound of voices. She could not make out the words. Then silence. Then Tobias came around the bend on Cassidy with an expression that was entirely neutral. Del Stringer, he said. Heading back to Santa Fe, she stared at him. What did you say to him? He considered this. I explained the situation clearly, Tobias. I told him that the documents existed in copies that had already been sent to Judge Almont in Santa Fe by another route, he said, and that if anything happened to either of us, those copies would go immediately to the federal authorities in Washington. She stared at him. That is a bluff. Yes, he said, but it is a believable one, which is what matters. Stringer is pragmatic. He will report to Cole that the risk of proceeding outweighs the benefit. Cole will do his own arithmetic. He paused. And it buys time. Time for what? For us to reach Albuquerque, he said. After which the documents are in Durward's hands and the threat shifts from you to Voss, which is where it belongs. She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. You are very good at this, she said. Yes, he said without arrogance. I have had a great deal of practice. They reached the outskirts of Albuquerque on the following evening, as Tobias had calculated, and found a boarding house where they each took a room and ate a meal that felt, after 3 days on the road, almost extravagant in its warmth and simplicity. She had the strongbox on the table in front of her and her hands flat on either side of it, and she felt the strange, suspended quality of being at the end of a long effort. Tomorrow morning, she said. Marshal Durward's office. I will go with you, Tobias said. She looked at him. You do not need to, she said. I know, he said. She looked at the strongbox for a moment, then she looked at him. Tobias, she said, when this is over I would like to go back to Caldera. He was very still. There is nothing keeping me in Albuquerque, she said. And I have been told it is a quiet town. She paused, with honest people in it. He looked at her across the table with those green eyes that gave and concealed in equal measure. That is true, he said very quietly. I was also told, she continued, by a man whose judgment I have come to trust significantly, that it is a good place to sort things out. He looked at her for a long moment. Josephine, he said. Yes. She said, and she hated how soft her own voice sounded but found she could not do anything about it. When this is over, he said with great care, I would like very much to take you to dinner, in Caldera, in a proper dining room, not on the ground in the desert. She felt warmth move through her entire chest at once. That sounds, she said, entirely acceptable. The corner of his mouth moved. Good, he said. Marshal Calvin Durward was indeed as honest as she had been told. A severe, efficient man in his mid-50s with a prosecutor's attention to detail, and a visible disgust for the kind of corruption she laid before him. He spent 2 hours going through the documents with her and Tobias present, asking precise questions that she answered with equal precision, while Tobias sat against the wall and said nothing, and was entirely reassuring simply by existing there. When Durward finally looked up from the ledger and the letters, he said, Miss Zahar, this is sufficient to open a federal investigation into both Voss and Cole. I want you to understand that the process will take time and will require your testimony eventually. I understand, she said. And I want you to understand that until an indictment is secured, there remains some risk to your safety. I understand that too, she said. Durward looked at Tobias. Mr. Wren, I know your name. Most people in this territory do, Tobias said. Your involvement in this matter is personal, Tobias said, not aggressive, just precise. Durward studied him for a moment and then, apparently, accepted this. I will be in contact, Durward told Josephine. He stood and held out his hand, and she shook it with the steady grip of someone who had been waiting 2 months for this exact moment. When they stepped out of the marshal's office into the Albuquerque morning, the air was cold and bright, and she could feel the absence of the weight she had been carrying the way you feel the absence of a chronic pain when it finally releases, all at once, with a disorientation that is close to grief and close to joy simultaneously. She stood on the boardwalk with her eyes closed for a moment, Tobias stood beside her, not touching her, just there. "It is done," she said. "The first part," he said. "Yes." She opened her eyes and looked at him. In the Albuquerque morning light, without the desert dust and the urgency, he looked younger, less contained. His green eyes were very clear. "You mentioned dinner," she said. He looked at her with that not quite smile that she had become, she realized, absolutely reliant on. "I did," he said. "In a proper dining room," she said. "In Caldera," he agreed. She looked at him for another moment. "Tobias," she said, "I am not a simple proposition. I want you to know that." "I had formed that impression," he said. "I have a case to testify in eventually. I have complicated circumstances, and I am not," she hesitated. "I am not accustomed to trusting people easily." "I am not accustomed to being trusted easily," he said, "or to trusting easily myself." He paused. "I thought we might try both things." She looked at him for a very long moment. Then she said, "Yes," and it meant approximately 100 things at once, and he heard all of them, and something in his face changed in a way that she decided she would spend a considerable amount of time looking at again in the future. They rode back to Caldera in 3 days by the proper road, because the urgency was gone and the weather was clear, and there was no particular reason to rush. They talked for most of it, real conversation now. Not the careful, measured exchanges of the road under pressure, but the longer, more exploratory kind where you discover what a person actually thinks about things. He thought, she discovered, deeply and specifically about justice. Not in an abstract way, but in the concrete, granular sense of what was fair between specific people in specific situations. He had a kind of moral precision that surprised her, and did not surprise her in equal measure, because it explained all the choices she had observed him making. She thought, he discovered about systems, how things worked, how they could be made to work better, what the machinery of institutions looked like from the inside and where the gears caught. She had an architectural mind applied to social structure, and she talked about it with a fluency that suggested she had been thinking about these things for years without having many people to think aloud with. They were, it turned out, surprisingly well matched in the way of people who approach the same problems from different directions and arrive at similar places. They arrived back in Caldera on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and Ruth Hayden met them at the hotel door with an expression that suggested she was not at all surprised to see them together, and had formed opinions about the situation that she was once again keeping to herself. "Your wagon is in Osai's yard," Ruth said to Josephine. "He finished the axle and did not charge extra for the weight." She looked at them both with her sharp, kind eyes. "I have 2 rooms." "Thank you, Ruth," Tobias said. Ruth nodded and went inside. Josephine looked at Tobias on the hotel steps. "Dinner tonight," she said. "Tonight," he agreed. Dinner was at the Red Ryder, which had a dining room on one side of the saloon proper. A small, imperfect dining room with mismatched chairs and a menu that was limited but reliable. They sat across from each other at a table near the window and ate properly for the first time in days, and talked without stopping for 2 hours. And somewhere in the second hour, across the table, she reached out and placed her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And that was the first touch that was not practical. It was not a small thing. Neither of them pretended it was a small thing. He walked her to the hotel afterward in the cold night air, and they stood on the steps for a while, not wanting to go inside and end the evening, talking about smaller things, the stars, the quality of the night, whether the Red Ryder's coffee was as good as Ruth's. It was not. Then he looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked at him, and he lifted one hand and touched her face very gently, just the back of his fingers against her cheek, and said, "Good night, Josephine. with such quiet sincerity that she felt it move all the way through her. "Good night, Tobias," she said. She went inside. She climbed the stairs. She stood in her room in the dark for a minute before lighting the lamp. She decided, in very serious trouble, the kind of trouble she had absolutely no objection to. The weeks that followed were the slow building of something that neither of them rushed, because both of them had enough history to know the value of building carefully. He stayed in Caldera. He had said between work, and between work he remained, and she did not ask him to, but she was aware of the choice being made. She arranged the repair of her wagon and began the practical work of establishing herself in the town. She called on Sheriff Hatch and explained her legal background, and Hatch, after a thoughtful pause, asked if she would be willing to review some documents that had been sitting in his office for months in need of someone who could make sense of them. She could. She did. Word traveled the way word did in small towns, and within a week she had 2 more requests for legal assistance: a property dispute between neighbors, and a woman who needed help writing a letter to a territorial authority about a pension claim. She helped with both and received modest payment for both, and discovered that there was a need in Caldera for someone with her skills that had simply never been met because no one with those skills had been present. She was building something. She could feel it. Tobias watched all of this with a quiet pleasure that he did not entirely conceal, which was how she knew it was genuine. He concealed things effectively when he chose to, so when the pleasure was visible, it was because he had decided not to hide it. They had dinner together 3 and 4 evenings a week. They walked together in the mornings when the weather was good. They sat in Ruth's common room in the evenings with books or tasks. She often had documents to review. He was reading his way through a small collection of books she had produced from her trunk that he had not expected to be there. One evening he looked up from the book he was reading, an account of legal reform movements in the eastern states, and said, "Where did you get this?" "I collected it," she said, without looking up from her own work. "Over several years." "There are 40 books in your trunk," he said. He had helped her retrieve them when she moved the trunk to her room. 43, she said. He looked at the book. "You lugged 43 books across the desert in a wagon that broke down." "Yes," she said, "on the run from 2 men employed by a corrupt land commissioner." "Yes." He looked at her with something in his face that she had been seeing with increasing frequency, something warm and unguarded and slightly wondering. "Josephine," he said. She looked up. "I think you are remarkable," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "I think you might be the first person who has ever said that to me," she said, and meant it, and saw from the look on his face that he understood the full weight of that. He came around the table, which he did not do often. He was careful with proximity, respectful of the space she needed, and he sat beside her instead of across from her, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and he said, "That seems like a significant failure on the part of everyone you have previously known." "It does, rather," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am very glad you broke your axle on that road." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from a place of genuine happiness rather than wit, and she looked at him, and he was looking at her, and neither of them looked away. He kissed her for the first time on a November evening, standing in the doorway of the hotel after their Tuesday dinner. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a kiss that said several things clearly and without qualification, and she kissed him back in kind, and when they separated, they were both very still for a moment. "I have been thinking about doing that for approximately 3 weeks, he said. "I know," she said. "You knew." "Tobias," she said gently, "I am very good at reading people." His mouth curved fully for once, a real smile, the kind she had been working toward since the beginning, and she thought, as she had thought increasingly, this is the person. This specific, quiet, extraordinary person. The winter passed in the warmth of that accumulating certainty. Marshal Durward wrote to her twice, once in December, once in February, with updates on the investigation. An indictment of Harrison Voss was secured in January of 1883. Prescott Cole fled the territory and was apprehended in Colorado in February. Several of the displaced families had their land grants reinstated through a territorial court order that Judge Almont presided over. Durward's letter in February mentioned her name as the individual whose evidence had made the case possible, and included a formal letter of commendation from the federal office. She read it at Ruth's breakfast table, and when she looked up, Tobias was watching her. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he agreed. She felt the full weight of it move through her, relief, satisfaction, and something larger than both, the sense of a thing properly accomplished. Those families and their land. It had mattered. "Are you all right?" Tobias asked. He asked it with a care that was by now completely natural between them. "I am very much all right," she said. She looked at him across the table. "Thank you for Albuquerque, for the road, for all of it." "It was not only for you," he said, "but you are welcome." She understood what he meant. He had done it because it was right. That was what he did, right things carefully, without fanfare. She loved him. She had been approaching that knowledge for weeks, the way you approach a fire in the cold, drawn by the warmth, aware that getting too close has its own risks. But sitting in Ruth's dining room in the February morning with the commendation letter in her hands and Tobias Wren across the table, the knowledge simply arrived without qualification. She loved him. She sat with it for another week. Then one morning she said, without preamble, while they were walking along the edge of town where the scrub began and the horizon opened up, "I love you." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to look at her with an expression that was different from any she had seen on his face before. Open, fully open, without any of the habitual containment, as if he had taken down something he had been keeping up for a long time and did not entirely know what to do with the absence of it. "I love you," she said again. "I thought you should know, clearly." He reached out and took her hand with both of his. "Josephine," he said. His voice was slightly rough. "I have been trying to find a way to say that to you for 2 months. 2 months, she said. "I did not want to be hasty," he said. She felt the absolute, overwhelming tenderness of this. "Tobias," she said, "we rode through the desert together for 3 days with a man following us. We are past hasty." He looked at her. Then he said, "I love you. I think I have been heading toward it since you told me your name in that hotel doorway." She stepped into him and he wrapped his arms around her, and she stood in the February morning with her face against the front of his coat and felt the steadiness of him, the solid reality of him, and thought, settled. This is what settled feels like. By spring, she had a small office. It was the front room of a building on the main street that the previous tenant had abandoned, and Sheriff Hatch had facilitated the arrangement with the landlord. She painted a sign for the window herself, in careful letters. J. Zahar, Legal Correspondence and Document Review. It was not a law practice. She had no bar examination, and territorial law in 1883 did not accommodate female lawyers. But it was the practical exercise of every skill she had, and it was hers and it mattered. Tobias helped her move in the desk, a heavy oak piece that Osai had built for her at a price that was clearly well below market rate, because Osai had opinions about who should prosper in Caldera, and then stood back and looked at the office with the expression she associated with his particular, quiet pride. "It suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed. She had put 3 of her books on the shelf behind the desk. The rest were in her room at Ruth's, where she was still living. She had been thinking about the room at Ruth's with increasing awareness of its limitations. "Tobias," she said. He was still looking at the office. "Yes." She looked at the back of his head, at the way the morning light came through the window across the floor, at the desk that Osai had built, and the sign she had painted and the 3 books she had chosen. "I am not interested in being at Ruth's indefinitely," she said. He turned. He looked at her. "No," he said. "No," she said. "I think the natural trajectory of the situation, Josephine," he said. "Yes. Will you marry me?" He said it without preparation, without a stage-setting speech, without anything other than his direct green gaze and the utter sincerity that was the most fundamental thing about him. She looked at him for a full 3 seconds. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her properly, right there in her new office in the spring morning, and she laughed against his mouth, and he pulled back to look at her with the real smile that she had catalogued as one of her favorite things in the world. "Obviously," he said. "Obviously," she said. "I built an office across the street from where you have been staying for 6 months, Tobias." He laughed. It was a sound she had heard in increasing frequency, and never got accustomed to, because it transformed him completely, stripped away the last of the habitual containment, and left him entirely present. She had decided that making him laugh was one of the worthiest projects she had ever undertaken. They were married in May of 1883 in the Caldera Church, which doubled as a schoolroom and smelled faintly of chalk, by the reverend who served 3 towns in the area and came through on a monthly circuit. Ruth Hayden stood as witness on Josephine's side. Sheriff Hatch stood on Tobias's. Frank Osai and his wife Margaret were in the front row, and behind them, to Josephine's genuine surprise, was a scatter of townspeople who had apparently decided that this was worth attending. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Santa Fe, a deep green that she had chosen deliberately. When Tobias saw her in it, he went very still in the way he went still when something affected him more than he expected, and then he said, very quietly, "That color is something." "I know," she said. "That is why I chose it." He understood what she meant, and his eyes did something that she recognized as being moved, and she reached up and touched his jaw, and he caught her hand there. "Ready," she said. "I have been ready for considerably longer than I have admitted," he said. She smiled. "Good." The ceremony was brief, and the reverend was efficient, and the vows they spoke were the traditional ones. But when Tobias said "I will" with his eyes on her face and his voice entirely level, she heard in it the specific weight of a man making a choice he had approached from a great distance and arrived at with complete conviction. She said her own "I will" and meant it down to the bone. They moved into a house at the edge of town, a modest house of 4 rooms with a good wood stove and a porch that faced west, which was Tobias's suggestion because he said the sunset was worth building toward. She thought he might be the most quietly romantic person she had ever met, and she suspected he had no idea. She told him this. "I did not know sunsets counted as romantic," he said, standing on the porch on their first evening in the house. "Everything you do counts as romantic," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I carried your trunk," he said, "on our first meeting," she said. "Yes, that was the beginning of it." He shook his head, but he was smiling. The real smile, the one that was only for her. It was in that first summer of their marriage that the belt came off the way it eventually had to. He had not taken work since the road to Albuquerque. He had not been asked, which was unusual, and he had not sought it, which was something else entirely. He was building something, she could see it in him, the slow construction of a different kind of self, the way he was gradually occupying the Caldera days with purpose that was not the old purpose. He helped Osai occasionally when there was heavy lifting required. He had taken an interest in the practical management of the church and school building, which needed consistent maintenance that the Reverend's monthly visits did not cover. He was, in other words, becoming a part of the town in ways that had nothing to do with a gun. But the gun was still on his belt. She had not asked him about it. She understood what it represented, not vanity or attachment to the old life, but the deeply physical habit of someone who had carried a weapon for safety for 10 years. It was like asking him to walk differently. She did not ask. But she thought about it. And he knew she thought about it, because he knew her by now with the specific depth of a person who has paid very close attention to another person for a sustained period of time. And one afternoon in August, on the porch, she looked at the belt and then looked away quickly, and he saw the look and what it contained. He said nothing that evening. The following morning, he went out to the yard behind the house, where he had set up a practice target in the early months, and he practiced with the Colt for a long time. She heard the shots from inside and understood what he was doing, saying goodbye to something. The way you have to say goodbye properly before you put it away. When he came inside, he cleaned the gun very carefully, the way he always did, with a cloth and oil and the particular patience he applied to things that deserved it. Then he put the gun in its holster. He set the holster and the belt on the table. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Josephine," he said. She understood what he was about to ask, and the understanding moved through her with a force she had not anticipated. "Tobias," she said. "Is this what you want?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, but I also," he stopped. He put his hand on the belt. "I have been carrying this for a long time. I do not know who I am without it." She crossed to him. She put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him very directly. "You are the man who stopped on a road because someone needed help," she said. "You are the man who spent 3 days in the desert, getting me somewhere safe, without once asking what was in it for him. You are the man who built 2 bookshelves in our house and stacked my 43 books in order of when I acquired them, because you asked me once what order I kept them in and you remembered." Her voice was very steady. "You are the man I married. The belt is something you do. It is not something you are." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, with a quietness that was different from all his other quietnesses, rawer, more open, "Will you ask me to put it away?" She understood the significance of the asking. He was not asking her to decide for him. He was asking her to share the moment with him, to be present for it. "Yes," she said. "Tobias, put it away." He picked up the belt and the holster. He walked to the trunk that sat in the corner of their bedroom, the same trunk that had traveled in his horse's saddlebag, that had sat on a hotel floor in Albuquerque, that had been carried across the desert, and he opened it and set the belt inside, beneath the folded cloth and the practical things, and he closed the lid. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. Then he turned. His hands were empty. His face was open in a way she had never quite seen it. She crossed to him, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her with the kind of hold that says more than words. And she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating, steady and strong, and thought, "This is the beginning of the next thing." The next morning was the morning he walked out of the hotel and onto the main street and unbuckled the old belt. A second one, a working one he kept for occasional use outside the house, and let it fall in the dust, because she had asked, and the town saw it happen. And the chapter of Tobias Wren the Gunslinger was finished in the full sight of Caldera's Main Street on a late September morning in 1883. The town absorbed it with the practical adaptability of places that have seen many things. What they saw after that was something different, and in time, something that became part of the town's understanding of itself. Tobias took a formal role in the maintenance and security of the Caldera School. when the school outgrew the church in 1884, because Josephine had spent the previous 2 years making the case to the town council that a proper school building was necessary and achievable. He helped build it, alongside Osai and 3 other men, and was present at the opening with a satisfaction that was perfectly visible on his face. The federal investigation of Harrison Voss concluded in the fall of 1883 with a conviction on 4 counts of corruption and fraud. Prescott Cole received a separate conviction in Colorado. Josephine received a letter from Judge Almont that said, in his characteristically formal register, that the New Mexico Territory owed her a significant debt. She showed the letter to Tobias. "He is not wrong," Tobias said. "He is very formal," she said. "He is a judge," Tobias said. "It is required." She laughed. He watched her laugh with the expression that was still, even after a year of marriage, entirely unguarded, the looking that was its own kind of love. In January of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Tobias on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the winter light coming through the window and 2 cups of coffee between them, because she did not know how to do things dramatically and had not tried. "I am expecting a child," she said. He looked at her. His face did the thing, the open, fully present thing, and then he stood up from the table so quickly that his chair moved, and he came around to her side and crouched down to be at eye level with her and took both her hands in both of his. "Are you well?" he asked. First thing. No celebration before the question. "I am perfectly well," she said, moved by the sequencing of it. He held her hands for a moment and looked at her with something in his face that she did not entirely have a name for, something that was happiness and fear and wonder all together, and underneath all of it a tenderness so large that it made her eyes fill. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her hands, both of them, very carefully. Their son was born in September of 1884 on a hot afternoon with Ruth Hayden and Margaret Osai both present and Tobias in the next room, which was as close as he was permitted. Josephine was efficient and determined in labor, which surprised nobody, and the boy arrived red-faced and emphatic and perfectly healthy. Tobias was allowed in after approximately 45 minutes, which he had spent in the next room being completely still in the way of someone doing violence to his own composure. Ruth opened the door and said, "Come in," and he came. She was in bed, and the baby was in her arms, and she looked up when he came through the door. He stopped in the middle of the room and looked at them. She had seen many things on his face over the past 2 years, but she had not seen this complete, undefended astonishment at something good. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with an expression she decided she would remember for the rest of her life. "He looks very earnest," Tobias said. "He has been here for less than an hour," she said. "I know," Tobias said. "He already looks earnest." "I think it is a character trait." She laughed, and the baby's eyes, dark like hers, tracked toward the sound. "What do we call him?" Tobias asked. They had discussed names but reached no firm conclusion. "Daniel," she said. "I have been thinking about Daniel." "Daniel Wren," Tobias said. Trying it, he looked at the baby. "Hello, Daniel." The baby was unimpressed. "He will grow into it," Josephine said. "I expect so," Tobias said, and looked at her with so much in his eyes that she had to look away for a moment to manage it. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the baby. For everything." "Thank you," he said, with the same scope. Daniel Wren grew, as babies do, with the inevitable speed that becomes the primary fact of parenthood. He was earnest, as Tobias had identified, and meticulous, which came from his mother, and possessed of a humor that was drier than most people expected, and appeared to come from a combination of both. Josephine's office expanded. By 1885, she had a formal arrangement with the sheriff's office to review all contracts involving land transactions within the county, a role she had argued for on practical grounds, and which the town council had approved because the practical grounds were irrefutable. It was not a courtroom. It was not a law degree. But it was real work doing real things, and she was satisfied with it in the particular way of a person doing work that aligns with what they are for. Tobias ran the school maintenance and had also, somewhat to his own surprise, become the de facto coordinator of the town watch, a voluntary rotation of reliable men who kept an eye on things after dark. He had organized it at Sheriff Hatch's request in the winter of 1884, on the grounds that Hatch was getting older and the deputy was frequently unreliable. "You are the town's unofficial security," Josephine told him. "Without the gun," he said. "Without the gun," she agreed. He was comfortable with this. More comfortable, she thought, than he had ever been with the other version. In 1886, they had their second child. A daughter, this time, born in the spring, small and black-haired and fierce, who screamed with remarkable volume from the first moment, and continued to do so at intervals for several months, to Daniel's solemn fascination and Tobias's completely undisguised delight. "She is very loud," Josephine said, in the late-night hours of the first week. "She knows what she wants," Tobias said, which he meant as a compliment and which Josephine understood as one. They named her Clara. Clara was, from the earliest age, completely unintimidated by anything or anyone, which her father regarded with the pride of recognition, and her mother regarded with the particular resigned affection of someone who sees their own qualities taken to their logical extreme. The years built on themselves the way good years do. Not without difficulty, because nothing is without difficulty, but with the consistency of people who have committed to something and mean it. Ruth Hayden became, over time, something of a grandmother to Daniel and Clara, who visited her dining room with a frequency she privately found deeply gratifying. Frank and Margaret Osai were the closest thing to family in Caldera, outside of their own four walls. Sheriff Hatch retired in 1887. The town council, after a discussion that Josephine was present for in her capacity as the council's legal reviewer, offered the position to Tobias. She was present when he was asked. She watched his face do the thing where it went very still before he responded. "I will take it," he said, "on the condition that the position comes with a formal salary and the authority to hire a deputy of my own selection." The council agreed. He came home that evening to find her in the office, which she kept late on Tuesdays, and she looked up from the document she was reviewing and saw his face. "They asked you," she said. "Yes." "And you said yes." "Yes." She set down her pen. She looked at him, the man who had come around a curve in a road 4 years ago to find her standing next to a broken wagon, and had since then become the most important person in her world. "Sheriff Wren," she said, the real smile, full and unguarded. "It sounds better than it should," he said. "It sounds exactly right," she said. She stood up and crossed to him, and he put his arms around her in the office where she had put 3 books on a shelf that now held considerably more, and she thought, this, all of this. Daniel was 6 years old when his father took the sheriff's badge. He informed his friends at school that his father had been a very skilled and very famous gunslinger who had given it all up, and that this was both more heroic and more interesting than just being a sheriff, a position which he also recognized as important and would not tolerate anyone speaking ill of. Clara, at 4, was primarily interested in Cassidy, who was still living a comfortable and largely retired life in the Caldera livery, and who tolerated her ministrations with the philosophical acceptance of an aging horse who has seen too much to be startled by small, fierce humans. In the summer of 1887, a reporter from the Albuquerque Tribune came to Caldera on the trail of the story of how Harrison Voss had been brought down. He had traced the thread back to its origin and arrived at Josephine's office door. She agreed to speak with him. The article, which ran in September of 1887, was accurate and thorough, and said that the evidence that broke the Voss case had been gathered single-handedly by a legal clerk in the Santa Fe Territorial Records Office and transported, at considerable personal risk, to the federal marshal's office in Albuquerque. It named her. It mentioned the injustice done to the displaced families and identified the ones whose land had been restored. It did not mention Tobias, which she had requested, and he had accepted without comment. She read the published article at the breakfast table. "This is accurate," she said. "It should be," Tobias said across the table. "You told him the truth. He wanted to include you, I know. You were not interested." "I carried a trunk and shared some road information," he said. "It is your story." She looked at him. "It is not remotely that simple." "Josephine," he said, with the gentleness that was by now as familiar as breathing, "you found it, you gathered it, you ran with it when you had to, you delivered it, and you testified for it. I held the reins for a few days. You told Del Stringer a convincing lie in the middle of the desert," she said. "That is my single contribution to territorial justice," he said, "and I am content for it to remain unrecorded." She shook her head. She looked at the article. She thought about the families, the names she knew now, from the court records she had reviewed, the people who had gotten their land back and were living on it again because she had done what she had done. "It was worth it," she said. All of it," he agreed. She folded the paper and set it aside and looked at him across the table. "I am going to make an observation," she said. "Go ahead," he said. 4 years ago, in October, you came around a bend in a road and found a woman with a broken wagon and a strongbox full of trouble, and you helped her without being asked and asked nothing in return." "I asked nothing," he said, "because it was not my business." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. "And now you are the sheriff of this town, and I have an office on the main street, and we have 2 children and a house with a porch that faces west." "Yes," he said, "we do." She looked at him, this man who had been made for one kind of life and had, with characteristic precision and commitment, chosen another. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "Josephine," he said, "I have not had a single morning since I met you where I did not think that I was exactly where I should be." She felt it move through her the way it always did when he said something like this, quietly and completely. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she told him. "I thought the sunset porch came close," he said. "The sunset porch was very strong competition," she admitted. He reached across the table and took her hand, and held it in the easy, certain way of someone for whom this specific gesture had become one of the fundamental practices of his daily life. In the autumn of 1889, 6 years after that morning on the main street when the belt hit the dust, they stood together on the porch of their house and watched the sun go down over the Caldera Plain. Daniel was inside doing the reading assignment his teacher had set. He was, at 9, a serious and slightly precocious student who took his obligations gravely and discharged them thoroughly. Clara was on the porch steps, drawing something in the dust with a stick with the concentration of an artist who will not be interrupted, which was her general character applied to whatever she happened to be doing. Josephine leaned against Tobias's side and he put his arm around her, and they watched the sky do what it did over the New Mexico desert, turn colors that should not be possible, amber and rose and a deep violet that came in at the edges. "I wrote to Judge Almont today," she said. "About The Santillana family. Their land claim is still in dispute through the county court. I believe there is an error in the original survey that Almont can help address. He was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was thinking it through. There is a new surveyor out of Santa Fe, he said. James Birch. He came through here in the spring. He is meticulous and he charges reasonable rates. I know James Birch, she said. I reviewed one of his surveys last spring. He is very good. Then, between Almont and Birch, the Santillanas might have a real case. That is my assessment, she said. She felt him look down at her, though she did not look up. You are never not working, he said. Not a complaint, an observation. Neither are you, she said. Fair, he said. Below them on the porch steps, Clara made a sound of satisfaction at whatever she had been drawing and then looked up at the sky with the direct, assessing look she applied to everything. The sky is on fire, Clara announced. It does that, Tobias said. I know, Clara said, with the patient superiority of a 7-year-old explaining something obvious. I am explaining it for anyone who has not noticed. Josephine laughed. Tobias laughed. Clara looked at them both with mild, benevolent tolerance and returned to her drawing. Tobias pulled Josephine a little closer and pressed his mouth briefly to the top of her head. Josephine, he said. Yes. Thank you for breaking your axle on that road. She turned to look up at him. His green eyes were warm in the sunset light. He was 35 years old, and his face had the lines that came from years of attention and weather and the good kind of living, and she thought, as she had thought many times and never tired of, this face. This specific, quiet, extraordinary face. Thank you for stopping, she said. He kissed her properly then, right there on the porch, and Clara made a sound of theatrical disgust from the steps. Daniel, Clara called into the house. They are doing the kissing again, I can hear, Daniel called back with equal theatricality. You should come see. It is embarrassing. I am busy. Tobias broke the kiss and looked at Josephine with his real, full, entirely unguarded smile, and she looked back at him with the same. We are an embarrassment, she said. Apparently, he said. Good, she said. Very good, he agreed. The sun finished its performance, and the sky went to its evening colors, cool purple and deep gray and the first pale stars. And the Wren family of Caldera, New Mexico territory, stood and sat on their west-facing porch in the quiet, and the quiet asked nothing of any of them at all. Inside the house, in the trunk in the corner of the bedroom, under the folded cloth and the practical things, the belt and the holster and the ivory-handled Colt lay undisturbed. They had been there for 6 years. They would stay there. There was no reason ever to take them out again. Tobias had put them away the day she asked him to, and he had never looked back.